When people say they've hit a wall, what they often mean is that life has stopped returning their investment. The job that once gave meaning feels hollow. The relationship that once grounded them feels foreign. Even the body seems to move through the day with no signal from the soul. And yet, beneath this collapse, there's a strange intuition. Something is reorganizing me. Jung would have called this the threshold of transformation, a point where the psyche, not the ego, takes control. This isn't burnout, he might whisper. It's your psyche withdrawing its energy from the outer world so it can heal itself. Jung wrote that what we call neurosis is often the suffering of a soul that has not discovered its meaning. So the very thing that feels like your undoing is also the psyche's attempt to restore balance. The dark night begins not because something has gone wrong, but because the old psychic system has exhausted its meaning. In his Red Book, Jung described a period when he too felt stripped of all certainty. I faltered and stumbled and was filled with anxiety, for I had no idea what was happening to me. He was a man who had achieved everything his culture praised, a successful doctor, a respected scholar, and then one day he felt nothing. The outer achievements turned into shells. What followed was not depression in the medical sense, but descent into the underworld of his own soul. The spirit of the depths, he said, took my understanding and all my knowledge and placed them at the service of the unknown. And that's how the night begins, for all of us, not with thunder, but with silence. A sudden loss of meaning that feels like punishment, but is, in fact, initiation. When the psyche wants to move toward greater wholeness, it must first dismantle the structures that no longer serve that growth. The ego, built from habit and image, begins to crumble. The routines, the titles, the roles, they disintegrate. And we call it failure or burnout or depression. But Jung would say, what was true once is no longer true now because yourself has outgrown it. Imagine the psyche as a house you've lived in for years. The rooms are familiar, the furniture arranged to please the ego's taste, safety, recognition, control. But one morning, a crack runs through the foundation. At first, you patch it, then another appears, and another. Eventually, you realize the house itself is too small for what's trying to live inside it. The walls must break for you to expand. That's not self-destruction, that's metamorphosis. The dark night of the soul is the psyche's way of renovating from the inside out. Everything that once supported you begins to fail, not to punish you, but to reveal what you were never meant to depend on. The outer world fades because the inner world is calling. Jung believed that every human being carries within them a blueprint of wholeness, what he called the self, and that life's crises are the self's attempts to bring the ego into alignment. You do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. So when meaning collapses, you are not losing yourself. You are being called deeper into yourself. What you feel as loss is actually the psyche retracting its energy from the outer illusions that once defined you. The libido, that vital psychic force, is being reclaimed by the unconscious to prepare for a new structure of being. Jung called this the night sea journey, the mythic voyage where the hero descends into darkness to retrieve the lost treasure of the soul. But here's the paradox. The ego thinks it's dying. It clings, resists, bargains, and despairs. It cannot imagine that this emptiness could serve a purpose. And yet, the very point of the dark night is to teach the ego its proper place, not as the master of the psyche, but as its servant. In this reordering, the center of gravity shifts from the surface self to the deeper self. The collapse, then, is not an ending, it's the necessary unmaking before new meaning can form. This, Jung might say, is the way the soul creates through destruction and rebirth. So when everything in you says, I'm losing myself, know that something truer is trying to emerge. The light will not come from resisting the night, but from walking through it consciously. That's where Jung's map begins, not in control, but in surrender. When Jung spoke of the night sea journey, he wasn't being poetic. He was describing something that happens in the psyche when outer meaning collapses, a withdrawal of energy from the world into the depths of the unconscious. He noticed this pattern in myths, in patience, and in himself. A time when the inner light goes out and life becomes strangely flat. It's not death, but suspension, a kind of sacred dormancy. He wrote, the unconscious works autonomously, and we can only follow its guidance, for it knows more about our destiny than we do. That's the paradox of the dark night. You can't think your way out of it, because thinking is the very tool that's breaking down. The mind that once organized your world has lost its map. The psyche, in its wisdom, begins to reclaim the energy you've invested in maintaining the persona, the outer identity that keeps everything looking fine. And so, you start to feel disconnected from everything that used to define you, the ambitions, the goals, the relationships, they no longer feel alive. Jung called this the withdrawal of libido. Psychic energy turns inward to refuel the deeper system. But to the ego, it feels like death, because the ego experiences meaning only through outer engagement. It doesn't understand that the current has simply changed direction. The ancients called it a descent into the underworld. Jung called it enantiodromia, the reversal of energy when something has gone too far in one direction. If you've been living entirely in your persona, in your image, your achievements, your social role, then sooner or later the psyche will demand balance. The further you drift from your inner life, the more violently the unconscious pulls you back. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, Jung warned. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. So the dark night is not a punishment, it's a correction. The psyche is reorganizing the whole system toward wholeness, which Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming the person you truly are, rather than the mask you perform. Individuation always begins with a kind of collapse, because something false must be dismantled before the truth can emerge. You might think you've lost control, but what's really happening is that control is being redistributed. The self, that deep organizing principle of your psyche, is taking over the project of your life. Jung once said, in each of us there is another whom we do not know. He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us from the way we see ourselves. During the dark night, that other, the self, becomes active. It begins to send images, symbols, and intuitions from the unconscious. You might notice your dreams becoming more vivid or your moods more extreme. You might feel a strange pull toward solitude, art, or nature, anything that opens space for the psyche to speak. And yet, there's still a temptation to fix it, to get back to normal. That's the ego's last defense. Jung cautioned that premature solutions only prolong the suffering. We do not solve our problems, he wrote. We grow larger than them. The night, therefore, is not a problem to be solved, but a metamorphosis to be endured. The psyche is recentering itself, taking energy from the false structures that kept you safe and redistributing it toward the parts of you that were ignored or repressed. This is why the dark night so often feels like an identity crisis. The structures that once gave you meaning, career, relationships, beliefs are now being emptied out. The psyche is creating space for new meaning to form, meaning that arises from within rather than being imposed from without. The descent strips you of false attachments until only what is essential remains. In one of his letters, Jung wrote, "The night sea journey is a kind of initiation. One has to endure it and accept it. Only then does the new light appear. The key word is endure. The psyche is not trying to destroy you, it's trying to evolve you. What dies in the night is not the self, but the illusion of separateness, the idea that you could live without dialogue with your own depth. And so, descent is not regression, it's incubation. Just as the seed must split in the dark soil before it can sprout, the psyche must go underground to regenerate. The silence, the emptiness, the loss, these are not signs of failure. They are the symptoms of reorganization. Something is being dismantled so that something else can live. When Jung emerged from his own dark period, he said he no longer believed in his ideas, he experienced them. He wrote, "I had to let myself be carried along by the current, for what the unconscious has to say is always something beyond our comprehension. That surrender, that willingness to descend without knowing, is the doorway to transformation." So the dark night isn't the end of your story. It's the moment the story starts to rewrite itself from a deeper author, the self. And if you can stay with it long enough, without escaping or naming it too soon, the same darkness that once felt hostile will become your teacher, because what descends must eventually rise, but as something new. There comes a point in every dark night when the outer story stops making sense. You wake up one morning, and what you used to believe about yourself, the adjectives, the titles, the life roles, no longer fits. You try to move the way you always have, but something invisible resists. It feels as if the axis of your world has shifted, and every movement costs more than it used to. Jung called this the dissolution of the ego's supremacy. To the ego, it feels like annihilation. To the psyche, it's liberation. For Jung, the ego was never meant to be the ruler of the inner world, only its steward. The trouble begins when the ego starts to believe it is the self. It identifies with the persona, the social mask, and forgets that it is merely one small center within a vast field of consciousness. In such cases, life eventually intervenes. Something cracks the image. The promotion doesn't satisfy. The relationship ends. The belief system fails. The gods have become diseases, Jung wrote, meaning that what once served us as living symbols has turned into lifeless concepts. The collapse begins when these idols fall. He described this process vividly. The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. The dark night, then, is the defeat necessary for a greater victory, the victory of truth over illusion. The ego, accustomed to steering the ship, suddenly realizes it's been navigating on borrowed energy. When the unconscious withdraws that energy, the ship drifts. The ego panics, mistaking loss of control for loss of self, but the psyche knows exactly what it's doing. It is dismantling the false captain so the true navigator, the self, can take the helm. This stage can feel brutal because the ego resists disintegration with all its strength. It clings to what's familiar, even if it's killing you. You might hear it whisper, if I just get busy again, if I just fix this one thing, if I can get back to how I was. But there is no back. The old identity has been outgrown. The structures that once sustained your sense of control now belong to a smaller version of you. Jung compared this to the shell of a chrysalis cracking open. In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. The ego collapses precisely so that consciousness can expand. The persona, that carefully arranged self-image, begins to lose its power. At first, it's humiliating. You may feel weak, unmotivated, or ashamed of your own confusion. But confusion is not failure, it's the first stage of reorientation. The map is being redrawn. You are moving from a life designed to impress others toward one that belongs only to you, and yet the descent into ego collapse can be terrifying. Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. The individual must give up the fantasy of absolute autonomy. That sentence contains the heart of the night. The ego must admit it is not the center of the psyche, that there are deeper forces at play. The unconscious is not the enemy, it is the other half of the mind, older, wiser, and infinitely more creative. During this phase, people often experience dreams of falling, drowning, or being swallowed by the sea. These are ancient symbols of the ego being absorbed by the larger totality of the self. You may feel like you're disappearing, but what's actually happening is that your boundaries are being dissolved so new ones can form. The task is not to fight the dissolution, but to witness it. Jung sometimes said that life is a continual process of small deaths. Every transition, every major transformation involves the death of a previous self. The ego collapses whenever the self demands more space. It's like the molten core of the psyche melting the surface structures that can no longer hold its heat. The pain you feel is the pressure of expansion. This is why the dark night is such a sacred paradox. You lose everything, yet what's truly yours begins to reveal itself. The ego's collapse strips away borrowed identities, the obedient child, the achiever, the rescuer, the martyr, until what remains is essence. In that emptiness, the self starts to whisper, but the whisper can only be heard once the noise of the persona is gone. Jung himself endured this breaking apart. He confessed, I had to let myself be annihilated by my own unconscious. He meant that he could no longer sustain the illusion of mastery. Only by surrendering to the psyche's deeper movement could he find his authentic center again. I had to realize that I am not what I thought I was, he wrote, but what the unconscious thinks of me. Ego collapse then, is not the end of consciousness. It is its rebirth. The pieces that shatter are the ones that could not hold truth. What remains after the storm is not the absence of self, but the foundation of real individuality. It's the moment you stop trying to be someone and start trying to become something. So when the old self begins to fall away, let it. Its ruins are the raw material for the next structure. The psyche never destroys without rebuilding. And soon, from those ruins, something darker and more alive begins to stir the shadow, the companion you've ignored, but who now steps out of the dark to join the story. After the ego breaks, something else begins to move in the ruins. It is not light that comes first, it is shadow. The parts of yourself that were buried under ambition, performance, and fear start to stir. These are not new forces, they are old exiles. And the dark night, cruel as it seems, is their invitation to return. Carl Jung called this hidden territory the shadow. Everything you've repressed, denied, or refused to acknowledge in yourself. It contains what you fear to see and what you long to reclaim. The shadow, he wrote, is that which you do not wish to be. And yet, paradoxically, it also holds everything you could become. Most people, Jung observed, spend their lives protecting their image of goodness. The persona must stay clean, admirable, competent, but beneath that mask lives all that was deemed unacceptable. Envy, rage, lust, greed, selfishness, grief, and also, ironically, creativity, power, and passion. Every trait you reject doesn't vanish. It moves underground and waits. When the ego collapses, the shadow seizes its chance to speak. You start to notice strange reactions, irritations that come out of nowhere, jealousy that shocks you, attraction to things you once judged, memories you thought were gone returning with force. Jung said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The more we deny it, the more it controls us. And during the dark night, denial is no longer an option. Dreams at this stage often turn darker. Figures appear who seem menacing or mocking. Jung would tell his patients not to flee these figures, but to listen to them. They are messengers, he said, not monsters. The psyche uses the language of symbol and image, not morality. The shadow doesn't come to destroy, it comes to restore balance. Its appearance is the soul's way of demanding honesty. To meet the shadow is to meet the unlived life, the roads not taken, the feelings suppressed, the truths silenced. Jung called this confrontation the moral problem of our time because it requires courage to admit I am not only what I admire, I am also what I condemn. The person who can face that without collapsing is on the threshold of true individuality. He wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Most people misread that line as pessimism, but it's an act of faith. Faith that light can only emerge where we have the courage to see the dark. When you turn toward your shadow, you stop fighting yourself. You begin to understand that wholeness includes everything, not just the parts that win approval. Consider the rage you repress because you were taught it's unspiritual, or the sensuality you hide because it threatens your self image, or the ambition you deny because it conflicts with your humility. These are not evils to be purged, but energies to be reclaimed. Jung compared them to gold in the mud, a treasure in the shadow. The work of the night is to dig through that mud without losing sight of the treasure. This confrontation can be raw. You may feel waves of shame, disgust, or grief as you realize how much of your life has been spent pretending. But that shame is not punishment. It's the ego's growing awareness of its own limits. Each time you integrate a piece of the shadow, each time you can say, yes, this too is me, a portion of psychic energy returns. The very vitality you thought you lost was simply trapped in repression. In the Red Book, Jung describes his own meeting with the shadow figure he called Elijah, and later with Philemon, his inner guide. Through dialogue with these inner figures, he discovered that what we reject becomes our teacher once we acknowledge it. I resisted the dark, he wrote, until I saw that it carried my soul's secret purpose. That's the transformation. The shadow shifts from enemy to guide. Practically, this means becoming curious about your reactions rather than moralizing them. Notice the person you dislike intensely, they probably carry a trait you've disowned. Observe the moments you overreact, those are doorways into the unconscious. Jung said that projections are the hook by which we catch our own shadow. What you accuse others of often mirrors what you can't yet admit in yourself. Integration doesn't mean indulgence, it means relationship. The shadow is not to be acted out, but dialogued with. That's why Jung developed active imagination, a process of entering into conversation with dream figures and emotions as if they were autonomous beings. Through this dialogue, energy flows between the conscious and unconscious, and the psyche begins to heal its split. In meeting your shadow, you begin to restore wholeness. The opposites within you, the saint and the sinner, the victim and the tyrant, the rational and the wild, start to coexist. Jung called this the union of opposites, the essence of individuation. The goal is not to become perfect but complete. So, the dark night is not just a descent, it's an encounter. It's where you stop running from the parts of you that scare you and begin to see them as part of your own depth. The shadow, once embraced, becomes an ally, a source of vitality, empathy, and insight. And once you've faced it, the inner architecture begins to change. Dreams grow more symbolic, the emotions soften, and meaning starts to return in strange, subtle ways. Something in the psyche, something ancient and vast, begins to reorganize itself. The night is not over, but the path forward has appeared, because when you stop fighting the darkness, it starts to speak in light. Once you've met the shadow, something extraordinary begins to happen in the psyche. Out of the ruins of ego and the dust of old certainty, patterns start to form, not through conscious planning, but through image, intuition, and dream. This is the phase Jung called symbolic transformation, when the unconscious begins to reorganize the psyche around the deeper center he named the self. The psyche, he said, speaks in images. When the rational mind no longer holds sway, when the conscious world collapses, symbols become the new language of orientation. You start to dream in a different register, not random fragments of the day's residue, but mythic, instructive imagery, descending staircases, vast oceans, dead trees sprouting green shoots, mysterious companions who guide or challenge you. Jung wrote, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. During the dark night, that door swings open. You may wake from such dreams unsure of what they mean, but something in you knows they matter. The ego wants to interpret, to translate everything into logic. The self wants to commune. Jung advised not to dissect a dream too quickly, but to sit with it, to let its mood, color, and feeling work upon you. A dream, he said, is a spontaneous self portrait of the situation in the unconscious. It's the psyche showing you where you truly are. In this stage, synchronicities begin to appear, those coincidences that feel charged with significance. You think of an old friend and they call. You open a book and find a line that mirrors your inner state. These are not accidents, they are the psyche's outer echoes, what Jung called meaningful coincidences. When the unconscious begins to reorganize, inner and outer life start to mirror each other, forming a dialogue between the self and the world. Jung's own transformation was filled with such symbols. In the Red Book, he describes visions of serpents, gods, and vast deserts. He didn't interpret them as fantasies but as communications from the deeper strata of the soul. The symbols of the self, he wrote, arise in the depths like stars in the night sky. They appear when consciousness has been sufficiently humbled, when the ego is no longer trying to dominate the psyche, but to participate in its unfolding. The psyche reorganizes itself through compensation, balancing the conscious attitude with what has been neglected. If you've lived too long in intellect, your dreams might flood with emotion. If you've been trapped in productivity, the unconscious may send images of stillness, confinement, even death, not as threats, but as prescriptions. Jung compared the unconscious to nature. It seeks equilibrium, not approval. This is the alchemical stage of the night. The raw materials, fear, shame, loss, are slowly being cooked down in the heat of awareness. Out of chaos, order begins to emerge. The psyche, no longer split between light and dark, starts to communicate in a unified symbolic field. Jung believed that paying attention to dreams was not superstition but psychology at its most empirical. Who looks outside dreams, he said. Who looks inside awakens. You might begin to notice recurring symbols. Water, the unconscious itself, fire, transformation, a child, the new consciousness being born, a wounded animal, an instinct asking for healing. Each symbol is both personal and universal. The more you engage them through journaling, painting, writing, or simply contemplation, the more the unconscious feels heard. And that act of attention is what allows reorganization to continue. Jung developed active imagination as a bridge between waking and dreaming consciousness. In it, you re enter a dream, image, or mood, let it speak, ask it questions, follow its story. This is how you transform the passive experience of dreams into a living dialogue with the self. Through this method, the inner world becomes not a maze, but a map. And as this dialogue deepens, meaning begins to reappear not as ideology, but as experience. Life starts to pulse again, but from within. Jung noticed that patients who engaged their dreams sincerely often recovered a sense of vitality long before they solved their problems. The psyche doesn't need perfect circumstances to heal. It needs communication. In this stage, the unconscious and consciousness begin to dance. The ego, humbled and now receptive, serves as the interpreter rather than the dictator. You start to sense guidance not from an external authority, but from a deep inner wisdom that feels ancient, impersonal, and profoundly loving. Jung called this voice the self, the archetype of wholeness and order that lives in every psyche. It doesn't speak in commands, but in symbols, moods, and small intuitions. To follow this guidance is not to obey, it's to align. The more you listen, the more life organizes itself around coherence. What once felt like chaos now reveals an underlying rhythm. The dark night hasn't vanished, it has become luminous. The darkness itself begins to glow with meaning. This is the moment when you realize the night was never punishment, it was architecture. The psyche was tearing down the false scaffolding to rebuild on a truer foundation. You begin to feel connected again, but this time not to roles or goals, to being itself. And from this inner coherence, the next movement begins. Energy libido starts to flow outward again. The soul, once turned inward to heal, now prepares to return to the world renewed. When the night begins to thin, you don't notice it at first. The dawn doesn't arrive as sunlight, it arrives as breath. The same world that once looked flat starts to shimmer again with faint traces of life. You make coffee, you sit by a window, and for the first time in months, something small, a bird's movement, the sound of rain feels quietly significant. This is how reintegration begins, not in grand epiphanies, but in the psyche's slow reconnection with the living world. Jung believed that the goal of the dark night was not bliss or escape, but wholeness. The privilege of a lifetime, he wrote, is to become who you truly are. That process begins the moment energy libido returns to the outer world, but now under new management. The ego is no longer trying to dominate the psyche, it has become its instrument. The self, the inner organizing principle, begins to radiate through your actions, your relationships, your creative work. After the symbolic reorganization comes embodiment. The insights that once lived in dreams now begin to take form in choices. You might find yourself drawn to different kinds of work, different people, different rhythms of living. The old ambitions still exist, but they've lost their tyranny. They no longer serve your image, they serve your inner necessity. Jung wrote, as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. The light he spoke of wasn't moral perfection, it was consciousness, lived truth. Meaning returns through alignment. You no longer force life to prove your worth, you allow it to express your essence. This is the first sign of integration, authenticity without performance. The self, having reorganized the inner world, begins to express itself outwardly through spontaneous, grounded action. Jung described this as the coagular stage of alchemy. After dissolution, solve, the new form crystallizes. The scattered elements of the personality, the ego, the shadow, the anima or animus, the instincts, come into relationship with one another. You begin to feel a subtle coherence, a quiet rightness. The psyche has found its new equilibrium. Even your suffering starts to make sense in retrospect. It wasn't meaningless pain, but the price of transformation. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, Jung said. People will do anything rather than face their souls. But once the soul is faced, once its demands are heard, the pain becomes wisdom. You might notice that your dreams shift tone, less chaotic, more structured. The symbols that once screamed now whisper. The unconscious doesn't need to shout anymore because you're listening. Your outer life begins to reflect your inner state. Relationships deepen, work feels purposeful, solitude becomes fertile instead of frightening. This is not happiness in the conventional sense. It's something subtler, a grounded joy that can coexist with sorrow. The ego, rebuilt around the self, is humbler but stronger. It no longer needs to be the center of the world, only the bridge between the inner and outer realms. Jung compared this integration to the restoration of the king in alchemy, the rebirth of a conscious ruling principle that serves the whole psyche rather than oppressing it. The self, he wrote, is not only the center but also the circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. You realize you are not a fragment trying to survive. You are a totality learning to live. At this point, the individual starts to carry what Jung called the transcendent function, the living dialogue between opposites. You can hold light and dark together without splitting. You can acknowledge grief and gratitude in the same breath. You are no longer seeking to escape contradiction because you've understood that truth itself is paradoxical. The psyche has taught you complexity, and complexity is the soil of wisdom. The sense of purpose that returns is quieter, less ideological. It's not about saving the world or proving your worth. It's about participation, about letting the self express its rhythm through you. The artist creates again, but now from inner necessity rather than ambition. The healer helps again, but now from empathy rather than ego. Even the simplest act, tending a garden, speaking kindly, creating order in a small space, feels like collaboration with something eternal. And yet, this stage is not an ending. Integration is maintenance, not perfection. Jung warned that consciousness is never permanent. It must be renewed daily through awareness. But once you've known this rhythm, the descent, the confrontation, the reorganization, and the return, you stop fearing collapse. You know that every ending carries the seed of a new beginning. The night has not disappeared, it has been interiorized. You carry it now as depth, a reminder that darkness is not the opposite of light, but its womb. The psyche that once disintegrated has reassembled, not as it was, but as it was meant to be. And from this new center, life begins to move outward again. You're ready not to escape the world, but to re enter it differently, deliberately, consciously. After every descent, there must be a return. But return does not mean going back. What you were before the dark night no longer exists, and that is precisely the point. The psyche has reorganized itself around a new center, and life must now be rebuilt from that deeper alignment. Jung often compared this stage to the hero's re-entry in myth. After the underworld journey, the traveler brings back the treasure, not gold, but wisdom, and must learn to live with it among ordinary people. In psychological terms, this is the challenge of integration into the collective. The individual who has met their shadow, who has dialogued with the self, is no longer naive. They've seen both the darkness and the light within. Jung warned that such insight can easily inflate the ego again, the danger of identifying with the self, he called it. After illumination, humility must return. You have seen the divine pattern, yes, but you are not the pattern, you are its vessel. The re-entry phase is therefore about embodiment, living what you've learned without dramatizing it. You reintroduce yourself to the ordinary, washing dishes, paying bills, making small talk, showing up on time. But this time, these small things feel meaningful because you bring awareness to them. Jung wrote, "The gods have become diseases, but we can make them virtues again." What he meant was that the luminous, when integrated, doesn't need to explode into miracles, it expresses itself through daily life. Your first task in re entry is patience. The new psychic structure is delicate. Don't rush to reinvent your life or to announce your transformation. Let it take root in silence. You might find yourself pruning friendships, changing habits, or altering your work, not as rebellion, but as adjustment. The psyche will guide you through subtle intuition, the same voice that once led you through dreams. Listen to it. The self never shouts, it nudges. You may also notice a new vulnerability. Having been stripped of your defenses, you are more permeable to the suffering of others. Jung said that true individuation makes us more human, not less. The one who has walked through the night cannot look away from pain, their own or another's. But this empathy, when rooted in awareness, becomes strength. You begin to serve not out of guilt, but from genuine participation in the web of life. Re entry means learning to live between two worlds, the inner and the outer. Too much in the inner, and you risk inflation, mistaking symbols for reality. Too much in the outer, and you lose the thread of meaning. The art of re-entry is balance. Jung called this maintaining the tension of opposites, holding both the sacred and the mundane, the eternal and the temporary, the invisible and the visible, without collapsing into either. He illustrated this through alchemical imagery. The philosopher's stone, born from the union of sun and moon spirit and matter, must remain in the world but not of it. That's your task now. You carry an awareness of eternity inside a finite life. You no longer need to escape into mysticism or retreat into cynicism. You can inhabit both, fully human, fully aware. During this stage, it helps to create practices that anchor the self in the everyday. Jung himself painted, carved, and built his tower at Bollingen with his own hands, physical expressions of inner order. You might find your own version of that: journaling, art, gardening, walking, or mindful work. These are not distractions, they are rituals of integration. They remind the ego that the divine must have form. Re entry also requires discernment. Not everyone will understand what you've experienced. Trying to explain it too soon can fragment the insight. Jung wrote, "The experience of the luminous is ineffable. One can only live it. The best testimony to transformation is your presence, how you move, speak, and respond. The people around you will feel it even if they don't have words for it. Eventually, you notice something subtle. The same world that once felt meaningless now feels sacred, not because it changed, but because you did. You no longer search for transcendence in grand visions, you find it in participation itself. The self has entered time, and every gesture, every conversation, every act of care becomes a small sacrament of wholeness. This is the essence of Jung's individuation, to live a life that expresses the totality of who you are. The night has taught you that light cannot exist without darkness, that order cannot exist without chaos, and that the self cannot exist without the ego to serve it. You re enter the world not as a teacher, but as a witness, someone who knows that life's purpose is not to avoid suffering, but to transform it into consciousness. And perhaps the most beautiful realization is this: you no longer fear another night. Because you've walked through one, you understand that descent is part of rhythm. The psyche moves in cycles, expansion and contraction, illumination and obscurity. The night will come again, as it must, but you will meet it differently. You will not mistake it for failure. You will know it as the soul's renewal. So, re-entry is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of conscious living, where your inner and outer worlds finally mirror each other. You are not healed in the ordinary sense. You are whole. You no longer chase light, you carry it. Every transformation, no matter how complete it feels, eventually leads to another threshold. Jung understood this deeply. Individuation is not a single event, it is a living process, a spiral, not a line. Each revolution through the spiral takes you closer to the center, but the path must curve back through shadow and confusion again. What feels like relapse is often refinement. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain, and people will do anything to avoid their souls. Yet the soul insists on being heard. The soul's insistence is rhythmic. The dark night returns whenever consciousness outgrows its old form. It's not a punishment for forgetting. It's the psyche's way of reminding you that growth never stops. You may have thought you were finished, that the great descent had happened, and now you could live in light. But then a new conflict emerges, subtle at first: restlessness, irritation, the sense that the clarity you once had has gone dull. The dreams darken again, the old patterns reappear in new disguises. That's when you know another cycle is beginning. The difference is that this time you recognize the pattern. The fear is still there, but beneath it lives trust. You remember that collapse is not destruction but renewal. You've learned to read the signs, the withdrawal of energy, the fatigue, the quiet inner voice whispering, "Pay attention." What once felt like annihilation now feels like instruction. Jung compared this ongoing process to alchemy's endless work, the opus circulatorium, the circular operation of transformation. "The stone is never finished," he wrote, "for it is a living thing. So too is the psyche. It keeps refining itself, distilling new consciousness out of old contradictions. Each night brings the next layer of the unconscious into awareness, and each dawn integrates it a little more fully. This is why individuation is not about reaching perfection, but about cultivating relationship between ego and self, light and dark, conscious and unconscious." Jung said, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the opposites. That means the work never ends, because new opposites always emerge. Life, by its nature, produces tension, and consciousness evolves through the effort to hold that tension consciously." In practical terms, this means that spiritual life is not linear progress. It's not about staying up or clear. It's about learning to move through contraction and expansion with awareness. The dark night will visit you in new forms through grief, change, loss, or uncertainty. But having walked the path before, you now know how to walk without panic. You trust the intelligence of the unconscious, You've seen that even the most painful dissolution serves the birth of a wider self. There's a quiet humility in this realization. Jung wrote, I am astonished, disappointed, pleased with myself. I am distressed, depressed, rapturous. I am all these things at once and cannot add up the sum. That's the confession of someone who understands wholeness not as harmony, but as complexity held in awareness. You stop trying to simplify yourself into a single story. You live as a constellation, aware that light and shadow move across your inner sky in eternal rhythm. The return of the night is not regression, it's conversation. Each descent speaks to a different part of the soul, one that wasn't ready before. Maybe the first night destroyed your false identity, the next one deepens your compassion, the one after that teaches you patience or humility. The self keeps shaping you, cycle after cycle, into a more transparent vessel for its light. And over time, something beautiful happens. You stop fearing the dark entirely. You begin to feel gratitude for it. You see that consciousness itself depends on these oscillations, that even the sun sets to rise again. Jung hinted at this when he said, no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The deeper the descent, the higher the ascent. They are the same motion, reversed. So, when another night comes, and it will, you will not fight it. You will turn inward with respect. You will light a candle. Keep your dreams close. Listen more than you speak. You'll remember that this is how the psyche breathes, in and out, expansion and contraction, life and death, over and over again. And one day you look back and realize that what you once called dark was never truly dark at all. It was the womb of light, the quiet chamber where meaning was reborn again and again. This is the wisdom the night leaves behind. Life is not a climb out of darkness, but a dance through it. And every time you fall a little more consciously, a little more willingly, a little closer to the self. Next section, final, closing reflection, the map and the mystery. Would you like me to continue with that final section next? Danoi? Yes. ChatGPT Danoi, tone, calm, luminous, and reverent. The guide has walked with the listener to the summit and now speaks not to instruct, but to leave them in quiet understanding. The voice carries both tenderness and awe. The rhythm is spacious, as if each word opens into silence. The goal here is completion without finality, to end the journey as it began, with mystery. Section 9, closing reflection. The map and the mystery, 5-6 minutes. By now, you've walked through every chamber of the night, the collapse, the shadow, the descent, the reorganization, and the slow rebirth of meaning. You've seen how the psyche dismantles what's false, how it restores what's lost, how it teaches through symbols instead of logic. But, as Jung would remind us, even the most complete map cannot replace the mystery itself. He once wrote, the way is not straight, but spiral. You climb higher and at the same time circle deeper. That is the paradox of individuation. The closer you come to the self, the less you can define it. You discover that your life, your loves, your failures, your nights were never random events, but the language of a deeper intelligence shaping you into wholeness. And yet, that wholeness cannot be grasped, it can only be lived. Jung never wanted disciples. He wanted consciousness. He said, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. That line captures the essence of everything we've explored. The dark night of the soul isn't something that happens to you, it's something that calls you. It calls you to become a participant in your own evolution. The pain, the loss, the silence, they are all the psyche's way of writing you back into the story of your own becoming. When meaning collapses, it isn't gone, it's simply retreating into the depths to renew itself. The ego, which once thought it was the author, realizes it was always a character. The true author, the self, has been writing all along, using every joy and every wound as ink. The task of consciousness is not to seize the pen, but to read with understanding. That's why Jung spoke of the religious function of the psyche, not religion as doctrine, but as relationship with the mystery that moves through us. He wrote, the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? The dark night teaches this relationship through direct experience. It strips you of all external gods so that you may meet the inner one, not an idol, but the living symbol of wholeness that dwells within. And yet, even after all this, the psyche remains larger than us. The mystery persists. Jung, toward the end of his life, admitted, I do not need to believe I know, but his knowing wasn't certainty. It was participation. It was a kind of surrender, the realization that the self is both within us and beyond us, shaping us as much as we shape it. The map we've walked together, descent, collapse, shadow, reorganization, integration, re-entry, is only a symbol itself, a human attempt to name the unnameable. It's useful, but partial. The true journey happens in silence, in the unseen movements of your own psyche. You may use Jung's words as lanterns, but they can only illuminate your path for a little while. The rest you must walk in darkness, trusting that the light inside you knows the way. And so, as we close, remember this. The dark night is not a detour from life, it is life. It's the pulse of becoming, the rhythm by which consciousness deepens. Every time you fall apart, you fall toward the self. Every time you lose meaning, it's because meaning is preparing to be reborn in a truer form. You were never being destroyed, only disassembled. You were never being punished, only recentered. The self was not taking something from you, it was taking you back into itself. So, when the next night arrives, and it will, you'll recognize it. You'll greet it like an old friend, whispering, Ah, we meet again. And you'll walk with it, not in fear, but in reverence, because now you know the dark is not the opposite of the light, it is its cradle. And as Jung wrote near the end of the Red Book, the way is within us, but not in gods, nor in teachings, nor in laws. Within us is the way, the truth, and the life. That is the map and the mystery